Davik Lorne was just another faceless drone in the grinding misery of Hive Varnax, a mid-level clerk buried in the Administratum sub-branch 4421, where he spent 15 years logging promethium quotas for the Hive's industrial sprawl. 8 million souls toiled in the Hive's steel guts, a brutal monument to human survival on a toxic world. That all changed when Sector 17's plasma reactor didn't just fail. It exploded in a sabotage-fueled inferno, or so the panicked Vox chatter claimed. No mere glitch, the blast was a betrayal, a radioactive firestorm that melted flesh to bone and twisted adamantium into grotesque, weeping shapes. Davik felt the tremors shake the manufactorum, dust cascading from the ceiling as klaxons wailed like dying beasts. The technicians' voices, sharp, almost unhinged, cut through the chaos, hinting at something darker, maybe a cult's hand in the disaster. He didn't wait for the monotonous Vox orders to stay put. His only thought was Ara, his wife, trapped in their HAB unit 10 levels down. He bolted, shoving through panicked crowds, stepping over bodies already claimed by heat or debris. The air scorched his throat, thick with the acrid tang of promethium and something fouler, something that didn't belong in a Hive's machinery. A sudden explosion rocked the corridor, collapsing a wall and sending a wave of scalding air that singed his uniform. Davik stumbled, his heart pounding, but kept running. The weight of his Administratum badge suddenly meaningless. Ara was all that mattered, and he'd tear through the dying Hive to reach her, even as the walls groaned and the floor buckled beneath him. Davik staggered through the collapsing corridors of Hive Varnax, his lungs burning from the toxic air, thick with smoke and the metallic stench of burning promethium. The residential block was a nightmare when he reached it, a graveyard of crumbled ferrocrete, twisted rebar, and flickering emergency lumens casting jagged shadows. His HAB unit, their small corner of mid-Hive life, was barely recognizable. The outer wall had caved in, exposing a cracked shrine to the Emperor, a splintered cot, and a scattering of ration tins glinting in the dim light. Ara, his wife, lay pinned beneath a massive support beam, its jagged edge crushing her right leg and hip into a grotesque pulp of bone and flesh. Her face, once bright enough to make the Hive's drudgery bearable, was a ruin of radiation burns, shrapnel cuts slicing across her skin like a brutal map. One eye oozed a sickly yellow fluid, a grim marker of rad poisoning. But she was alive, her lips trembling in a faint prayer to the Emperor. Davik dropped to his knees, clawing at the debris with hands that bled through torn gloves, ignoring the rad counter on his belt, screaming warnings of lethal exposure. The beam shifted just enough to free her, but Ara's gasps were shallow, her body quaking with pain and fever. He tore strips from his tattered uniform to bind her wounds, the fabric soaking red and yellow instantly, a futile gesture against the radiation eating her alive. A sudden tremor shook the HAB block, and a chunk of ceiling crashed down, missing them by inches, showering them with dust and sparks. The Vox crackled with garbled reports, secondary explosions, the central spire collapsing, coolant systems failing. Staying was suicide. Davik scavenged what he could, a cracked canteen, a half-empty medkit, fashioning a crude stretcher from the HAB unit's door and shredded bedding. As he lifted Ara's fragile form, a distant scream echoed, cut short by a wet gurgle, and the floor vibrated with another explosion. The Hive was dying faster than he'd feared, and the wastes beyond were their only shot, no matter how desperate. He dragged the stretcher toward the stairwells, his heart heavy with the knowledge that salvation might already be out of reach. Davik dragged Ara's makeshift stretcher through the crumbling arteries of Hive Varnax, each step a fight against the Hive's death throes. corridors were a choking maze of smoke and flickering lumens, the moans of the dying, blending with the groan of collapsing ferrocrete. Elevator shafts belched toxic fumes from the underhive, their machine spirits long gone mad. So Davik veered toward the emergency stairwells, his arms burning from Ara's weight. Her breathing was a ragged whisper, her face graying under the radiation burns. But she clung to life, her one good eye fluttering. At a junction, he stumbled over a squad of Adeptus Arbits sprawled across a barricade, their carapace armor blackened and melted, weapons still clutched in gauntleted hands. Whatever hit them, radiation, gas, or a pressure wave, had been too fast for a fight. Davik's stomach churned, but he grabbed a shock maul from a corpse, its heft alien to his clerk's hands, a grim necessity in the chaos. A sudden burst of static from a nearby Vox unit spat garbled warnings. Heretical sabotage detected. Warp signatures in Sector 17. The words froze his blood. This wasn't just a reactor failure. It was betrayal, maybe a cult's work. The floor shuddered as another explosion rocked the hive, a section of wall collapsing in a shower of sparks and debris, nearly burying them. Davik yanked the stretcher clear, his heart pounding. The outer hive wall loomed ahead, a jagged breach torn open to the ash wastes beyond. A toxic hellscape of gray-black dunes, chemical lakes, and howling rad storms. He didn't pause, dragging Ara through the gap as corrosive winds stung his face, the rad counter screaming louder. A sudden gust slammed into them, nearly toppling the stretcher, and Davik glimpsed movement in the distance. Shadowy figures, maybe scavengers, maybe something worse. The wastes were no sanctuary, just a different kind of death. But Varnax was a corpse, and Davik had no choice but to haul his dying wife into the poison. The shock maul, his only shield against the horrors waiting in the ash. The ash wastes stretched endless and merciless, a gray-black sea of toxic dust that crunched under Davik's boots as he hauled Ara's stretcher through the biting wind. The sky glowed a sickly yellow, smeared with black smog, the stars barely piercing the haze. Ara's breathing was a faint, ragged wheeze, her skin taking on a deathly pallor as radiation gangrene crept from her shattered leg, blackening her flesh. By nightfall, Davik found shelter in the rusted husk of a cargo hauler, its skeletal frame half buried in a dune. He set Ara down, her stretcher creaking, and checked her wounds, oozing, foul, untreatable with his meager medkit. As he cleaned her burns, she stirred, muttering not prayers but strange, disjointed words. Sigils, maybe, in a voice that didn't sound like hers. Davik's gut twisted. He'd found a cracked data slate in the hauler's wreckage, its flickering screen showing logs of a warp cult infiltrating Varnax's reactor controls, their runes matching Ara's whispers. The realization hit like a lasbolt. She wasn't just sick, she might be tainted. A sudden howl split the night. A mutant beast with a three-jawed maw lunged from the shadows, its 6 eyes glinting with unnatural hunger. Davik swung the shock maul, its crackling arc slamming into the creature's hide, sending it yelping into the dark. But its eyes lingered, promising a return. Ara's muttering grew louder, her clouded eye flickering as she spoke of the eye that sees. Davik's heart raced. Her words were no fever dream. They were a beacon, drawing something worse than beasts. A sharp crack echoed as a dune shifted nearby, exposing the skeletal remains of a crashed skiff, its hull etched with the same runes from the data slate. The wind carried a low hum, like voices just out of reach, and Davik's vision blurred, his rad sickness mixing with something darker. Whispers in his head urging him to leave her, to save himself. He gripped the maul tighter, shaking off the voices, but the fear lingered. Ara was becoming a danger, not just to him but to the Imperium itself, and the wastes were alive with cultists hunting for her secrets. Davik's body screamed with every step, his bones aching from radiation sickness, gums bleeding, clumps of hair falling free when he wiped his brow. Ara was fading faster, her wounds a mess of black-purple necrosis, her whispers now a constant stream of warped sigils that sent chills down his spine. They reached a cluster of ruined manufactorum outposts, their ferrocrete walls peeled open by rad storms like gutted beasts. Davik scavenged for supplies, rusted ration tins, a cracked canteen, when a sudden volley of last fire scorched the ground, kicking up clouds of toxic ash. Marauders emerged from the ruins, cultists in patchwork armor, their faces scarred with runes that glowed faintly in the dim light. Their leader, a hulking figure with a third eye carved into his helm, raised a stolen laser gun, his movements jerky, like a puppet on warp strings. Davik dove behind a slab of ferrocrete, dragging Ara's stretcher into cover as bolts seared the air, one grazing his shoulder with a hiss of burned flesh. His heart pounded, the shock maul heavy in his trembling hands. He lunged, the maul's crackling arc slamming into the leader's chest, dropping him in a twitching heap. The others scattered, their chants, guttural, unnatural, echoing as they retreated into the shadows. Davik grabbed a fallen auto pistol, its magazine holding only a few rounds, and hauled Ara deeper into the ruins. A sudden collapse of a nearby wall sent debris crashing down, nearly crushing the stretcher, and Davik's vision swam, the cultist's runes seeming to pulse in his mind. Ara's whispers grew louder, her voice not her own, chanting of the unmaking as if calling to the attackers. The realization hit hard. Her taint was drawing them, a beacon in the wastes. Davik's rad-sick body trembled, but he pushed on, the auto pistol's weight a grim reminder that he might need it for more than cultists. The ruins offered temporary cover, but the air hummed with unseen eyes, and Davik felt the warp's whispers clawing at his resolve, urging him to abandon Ara before her heresy consumed them both. Davik's legs burned, each step through the ash wastes a battle against his radiation-ravaged body, bleeding gums, bruises blooming like dark flowers, his vision doubling at the edges. Ara was a ghost on the stretcher, her skin mottled with necrosis, her whispers now a relentless chant of warped runes that made Davik's skin crawl. They stumbled upon a ruptured promethium pipeline, its rainbow-sheened chemicals pooling into a toxic lake that shimmered under the sickly sky. It was a desperate chance for water, so Davik knelt, filtering the least foul liquid through scavenged cloth into a battered canteen. A sudden geyser of corrosive gas erupted, scalding his hands and sending the canteen tumbling into the muck. Ara's stretcher tipped, her weak moan cutting through the hiss of fumes, her voice twisting into a hiss about the eye that sees all. Davik's head throbbed, his rad sickness blurring into something worse. Hallucinations of Ara, standing whole, her copper hair glowing, beckoning him into the poison lake. He shook it off, but the warp's whispers grew louder, urging him to leave her, to let the wastes claim her taint. A sharp crack split the air as a rusted hauler nearby collapsed, its frame giving way under the corrosive wind, nearly crushing them. Davik yanked Ara clear, his heart racing as he spotted movement on the horizon. Cultists, their patchwork armor glinting, riding mutated beasts with too many limbs. He clutched the auto pistol, its few rounds a pitiful defense, and dragged the stretcher toward a cluster of skeletal rocks for cover. Ara's chants grew frantic, her clouded eye fixed on nothing, as if answering the cultists' distant calls. The lake's fumes burned Davik's lungs, and the whispers in his mind turned vicious, painting Ara as a demon in human skin. He gripped the shock maul, his hands trembling, knowing the cultists weren't just after supplies. They wanted her, the vessel of their heresy. The oasis was no refuge, just another trap in a wasteland that seemed to pulse with malice, testing Davik's faith and pushing him closer to a choice he dreaded. Davik's body was failing, his radiation-sick frame racked with pain, gums bleeding, skin bruising without cause, clumps of hair peeling away in the toxic wind. Ara was worse, her stretcher a grim cradle for a body consumed by necrosis, her once beautiful face a map of black-purple rot. Her whispers had become a relentless chant, warped sigils spilling from her lips in a voice that wasn't hers, each word a stab at Davik's fraying sanity. They stumbled into an abandoned Mechanicus monitoring station, its auger arrays leaning like the bones of a dead leviathan, half buried in ash dunes. Inside, the air was stale but less toxic. A tomb of dust-covered cogitators and a tech priest's skeletal remains, mechadendrites fused to dead controls. Davik set Ara down, her chants echoing off the walls, drawing his eyes to a faint glow in the corner. He pried open a hidden panel, revealing a cache. Water purification tablets, a single dose of antibiotics, and a promethium canister, its seal intact. A functioning Auspex unit hummed to life, its flickering screen showing Hive Omnium just 30 miles east. A cruel spark of hope. Ara couldn't make it, not with her body shutting down and her mind leaking heresy. A sudden crash shattered the silence. Cultists breached the station's outer door, their mutant hounds snarling, claws scraping metal. Davik barricaded the data chamber with a rusted desk, his heart hammering, as Ara's chants grew louder, as if calling to the attackers. He administered the antibiotics, a futile gesture against her infection. But the promethium canister felt heavy with purpose. A low hum filled the air, not from the station, but from within his skull. Warp whispers painting Ara as a vessel of corruption, urging him to end her. A sudden explosion rocked the chamber, a cultist's crude grenade blasting a hole in the wall, letting in a gust of toxic ash. Davik fired the auto pistol's last rounds, dropping one attacker, but the hound's howls closed in. The Auspex's map burned in his mind. Omnium was close, but Ara's taint was a beacon, drawing death. The station was no sanctuary, just a crypt where Davik's faith and love were being torn apart by the waste's relentless malice. Davik's body was a wreck, his radiation-sick flesh screaming with every move, gums oozing blood, bruises spreading like ink, his vision flickering like a dying lumen. Ara was barely human on the stretcher, her skin a patchwork of necrosis, her chants now a guttural stream of warped runes that made the air feel heavy, wrong. They'd fled the Mechanicus station under a hail of cultist last fire. Davik's shock maul cracking ribs as he fought off a mutant hound, its triple jaws snapping inches from his face. He dragged Ara into the rusted hull of an Arvis lighter, half buried in ash, its Imperial Aquila corroded to a faint outline. The pilot's desiccated corpse still gripped the controls, a grim sentinel in the dark. Davik set Ara on a bed of tattered insulation, her whispers echoing in the cramped cargo bay, each one a nail in his fracturing resolve. The promethium canister from the station sat heavy in his hands, its purpose clear as the Auspex unit's map burned in his mind. Omnium was 30 miles away, a salvation Ara couldn't reach. Her eye, clouded and yellow, fixed on him, her voice hissing of the unmaking in a tone that wasn't hers. A sudden crash shook the lighter. Cultists, their voices warped by Vox amplifiers, breached the hull, their hounds' claws scraping closer. Davik's heart pounded. Ara's taint was drawing them, her chants a beacon for heresy. The warp whispers in his head screamed louder, painting her as a demon, a threat to the Imperium. He had no bullets, no time. only the promethium. With trembling hands, he poured the fuel over her wounds, the liquid hissing on her blackened flesh. Ara stirred, her eye pleading, human for a moment, but the whispers drowned her out, demanding purity. A cultist's blade slashed through a hull gap, grazing Davik's arm, and he ignited the promethium with a spark from the maul. Flames engulfed Ara, her weak screams tearing through the lighter as the fire burned out the heresy. Or so he prayed. The cultists hesitated, their chants faltering at the blaze, giving Davik a chance to flee through a crawlspace, the screams and smoke chasing him into the night. Davik stumbled through the ash wastes, the Arvis lighter's flames fading behind him, Ara's screams still ringing in his ears like a curse. His body was a ruin. Radiation sickness gnawed his bones, his gums bled with every ragged breath, and his vision blurred, doubling the toxic dunes into a nightmare haze. The shock maul dragged in his hand, its weight a reminder of the cultists he'd barely escaped, their mutant hounds howling in the distance. He clutched the Auspex unit, its flickering screen his only guide, confirming Hive Omnium lay 30 miles east, a cruelly close salvation he'd bought with Ara's life. The promethium's stench clung to him, mixing with the metallic taste of his own blood. A sudden gust of radwind slammed into him, nearly knocking him flat, the ash stinging his burned arm where a cultist's blade had grazed him. The whispers in his head, warp spawned, he was sure, grew louder, mocking his sacrifice, painting Ara's burning form as a demon laughing at his faith. He shook it off, but the wastes seemed to pulse with malice, the ground shifting underfoot as a dune collapsed, revealing the skeletal remains of a long-dead convoy, its vehicles scored with last burns. Davik's heart raced as he spotted movement. A lone cultist, his rune-scarred armor glinting, emerged from the shadows, wielding a jagged blade. Davik swung the maul, its arc crackling, but his weakened body betrayed him, the blow glancing off. The cultist lunged only to trip as a hidden geyser erupted, spraying corrosive gas that burned them both. Davik scrambled away, coughing blood, the cultist's screams fading behind. The Auspex hummed faintly, its power cell dying, but it showed Omnium's void shields on the horizon. A faint blue flicker through the haze. A sudden howl split the night. A hound, its triple jaws dripping, charged from a dune. Davik dove behind a rusted hull, his hands shaking as he powered down the Auspex to save its last charge. The whispers urged him to give up, to join Ara in the ash, but he ran. His rad-sick body pushed beyond reason, driven by duty and the fear that her taint might live in him. Davik's legs buckled as he staggered through the ash wastes, the horizon wavering under his radiation-ravaged eyes, blood pooling in his mouth from rotting gums. The Auspex unit, its power cell flickering, showed Hive Omnium's void shields glowing faintly, less than 5 miles away. A salvation he'd paid for with Ara's burning corpse. The promethium's stench still clung to him, her screams echoing louder than the mutant hounds trailing his scent. A sudden tremor shook the ground, a toxic geyser erupting nearby, spraying corrosive mist that burned his already scarred skin. He stumbled, the shock maul slipping from his grasp, and saw her, Ara, whole and radiant, a hallucination born of warp whispers, beckoning him to lie down in the ash. He screamed, shaking it off, and ran, his body a wreck of bruises and pain. The wastes shifted, exposing a ruined Imperial Guard outpost, its bunkers scarred by last fire, skeletons in tattered uniforms strewn about. A sudden burst of last bolts scorched the air. Surviving cultists, their rune-carved armor glinting, fired from a dune. Davik dove behind a ferrocrete slab, his hands fumbling for the maul, its charge barely sparking. A cultist charged, blade raised, only to collapse as a hidden mine detonated, showering Davik with ash and blood. He crawled forward, the void shields now a blazing blue wall ahead. Omnium's outer defenses loomed, Gothic spires, gargoyle-like gun emplacements, and Medicaid pavilions buzzing with activity. A patrol of guardsmen spotted him, their laser guns raised, and Davik collapsed, the auspex clattering beside him. Medicaid teams swarmed, their white suits marked with red sigils, injecting anti-rad compounds that burned through his veins. The camp was a lifeline. Radiation purgers, surgical suites, servitors tending survivors worse off than Ara had been. Davik's heart sank. They could have saved her body, but not her tainted soul. An Inquisitor's acolyte, clad in gray robes with a silver eye insignia, interrogated him, his questions sharp, about Varnax's sabotage, Ara's chance, the Prometheum ritual. The acolyte's eyes bored into him, suggesting warp taint had twisted his choice, that the wastes had made him a vector of heresy. Davik handed over the data slate, its cultist logs damning, but the acolyte's gaze lingered, marking him suspect. He'd survived, but at a cost. Ara's death, his faith shattered, his soul under Inquisition scrutiny. The wastes had taken the man he was, leaving a hollow servant, forever haunted by the fire and the whispers that might still live within him. Kalia Vren was a nobody in Hive Nexara, a medici aide stitching up workers in the lower wards, her hands stained with blood and antiseptic. The Hive, a towering slab of ferrocrete and despair, housed 9 million souls, all slaving for the Imperium's endless war machine. Kalia's days were spent in the dim glow of medici bays, patching burns and broken bones, until the geothermal core in Subsector 9 erupted. Not a failure, but sabotage. Vox chatter screamed of a warp cult, their rituals fracturing the core and unleashing a psychic plague that twisted minds as fast as it killed bodies. The air grew heavy, lumens flickering with unnatural pulses, and Kalia felt it. A crawling dread in her skull, like fingers prying at her thoughts. Her only concern was Torin, her younger brother, a manufacturing worker on the core's edge. She abandoned her post as alarms wailed, dodging collapsing gantries and panicked crowds. A sudden quake split the floor, swallowing a group of workers in a spray of molten slag. Kalia sprinted through the chaos, her medici kit bouncing against her hip, the Vox spitting warnings of heretical contagion and psychers unbound. The lower wards were a maze of smoke and screams, and as she reached Torin's station, a psychic pulse hit. Lights died, and a worker nearby convulsed, his eyes glowing before he lunged at her with a shard of metal. Kalia ducked, her heart pounding, and scrambled over debris to find Torin, praying he was still human. Kalia Vren was a nobody in Hive Nexara, a medici aide stitching up workers in the lower wards, her hands stained with blood and antiseptic. The Hive, a towering slab of ferrocrete and despair, housed 9 million souls, all slaving for the Imperium's endless war machine. Kalia's days were spent in the dim glow of Medicaid bays, patching burns and broken bones until the geothermal core in Subsector 9 erupted. Not a failure, but sabotage. Vox chatter screamed of a warp cult, their rituals fracturing the core and unleashing a psychic plague that twisted minds as fast as it killed bodies. The air grew heavy, lumens flickering with unnatural pulses, and Kalia felt it, a crawling dread in her skull, like fingers prying at her thoughts. Her only concern was Torin, her younger brother, a manufacturing worker on the core's edge. She abandoned her post as alarms wailed, dodging collapsing gantries and panicked crowds. A sudden quake split the floor, swallowing a group of workers in a spray of molten slag. Kalia sprinted through the chaos, her Medici kit bouncing against her hip, the Vox spitting warnings of heretical contagion and psychers unbound. The lower wards were a maze of smoke and screams, and as she reached Torrens Station, a psychic pulse hit. Lights died, and a worker nearby convulsed, his eyes glowing before he lunged at her with a shard of metal. Kalia ducked, her heart pounding, and scrambled over debris to find Torren, praying he was still human. The Underhive stairwells were a descent into madness, their rusted steps slick with oil and blood. Kalia half-carried Torren, his weight dragging as his mutterings turned to violent spasms, his hands clawing at her. The air was thick with the stench of rot and warped taint, lumens flickering with eerie violet pulses. A sudden explosion above sent a cascade of debris, forcing Kalia to dive, shielding Torren as Ferrocrete shattered around them. The Vox crackled with reports of cultist sightings, their rituals spreading the psychic plague. Kalia's Medici kit held a stub pistol, scavenged from a dead enforcer, its clip half empty, but better than nothing. At a landing, she spotted a data slate in the rubble, its cracked screen flashing cult runes and a map to a ritual site in the Underhive's depths. Torren's whispers echoed the runes, his eyes glowing brighter, and Kalia's stomach twisted. He was part of their plan, willingly or not. A pack of infected mutants charged from a side tunnel, their flesh warped with glowing sores. Kalia fired, dropping one, but the others closed in, forcing her to drag Torren into a narrow vent as claws scraped behind. The whispers in her head grew sharper, calling her a traitor for saving him, and she wondered if the taint was in her too. The Underhive was a labyrinth of rusted pipes and forgotten habs, its air heavy with psychic pressure that made Kalia's head throb. Torren's spasms worsened, his body jerking as he muttered about the gate's key. Kalia's hands shook, checking his vitals. His pulse was erratic, his skin fever-hot, glowing faintly under the burns. She found a derelict Medici outpost, its shelves looted, but hiding a vial of neurotoxin, a forbidden purge for psychic taint. A sudden burst of last fire shattered the silence. Cultists in tattered robes, their faces carved with runes, stormed the outpost, chanting in warped tongues. Kalia ducked behind a console, firing her stub pistol, each shot a desperate prayer. One cultist fell, but another hurled a crude incendiary, igniting a wall in a blaze of promethium. Kalia dragged Torren through a collapsing doorway, the heat singeing her back. His eyes locked on hers, human for a moment. But the runes he whispered tied him to the cult's ritual. The whispers in Kalia's mind screamed. She was saving a heretic, damning the Imperium. A falling beam nearly crushed them as the outpost buckled, and she fled deeper into the Underhive, the toxin vial heavy in her pocket, its purpose gnawing at her soul. The Underhive's tunnels twisted like veins, their walls pulsing with unnatural light as the psychic plague spread. Kalia's body ached, her vision blurring from exhaustion and the warp's touch, her arm bleeding from shrapnel. Torren was a dead weight, his chants now a low growl, his hands clawing at invisible enemies. A sudden psychic pulse hit, the air rippling, and Kalia saw him, Torren, untainted, smiling as he had in their childhood, a warp-born lie. She stumbled, shaking it off, as the tunnel shook, a sinkhole opening beneath them. Kalia grabbed Torren, rolling clear as the floor collapsed, revealing a chasm glowing with violet energy. Cultists emerged from the shadows, their blades etched with runes, one wielding a stolen plasma pistol that scorched the wall above her head. Kalia fired her stub pistol, emptying the clip, and scrambled into a side passage, dragging Torren's spasming body. The data slate's map showed the ritual site nearby, a nexus of warp energy where Torren's taint could unleash disaster. The whispers urged her to use the toxin, to end him before the cult claimed him. A mutant hound, its flesh bubbling with sores, lunged from the dark, and Kalaya barely deflected it with her kit, its claws raking her leg. She limped on, Torn's weight and the toxin's promise tearing at her heart. Kalia reached the Underhive's depths, a cavernous chamber where the ritual site pulsed with warp energy, its walls carved with glowing runes that burned her eyes. Torn's chants synced with the cavern's hum, his body convulsing, violet light leaking from his mouth. Kalia's head pounded, the whispers now a chorus, accusing her of heresy for protecting him. She found a Medicae console, its data confirming the cult's plan. A demonic summoning tied to Torn's taint. A sudden quake split the chamber, rocks falling, and cultists poured in, their leader chanting with a voice that warped the air. Kalaya ducked behind a pillar, her stub pistol empty, clutching the toxin vial like a lifeline. A cultist's lasbolt grazed her shoulder, and she dove, dragging Torn into a crevice as the cavern shook again. A stalactite crashing down, crushing two attackers. Torn's eyes glowed brighter, his body thrashing, and Kalia saw it, a flicker of his old self, pleading. The whispers screamed to purge him, and she hesitated, her love battling her duty. A psychic shockwave knocked her back, the air screaming with warp voices, and she knew the ritual was near completion. The toxin was her only weapon, but using it meant torment for Torrin, and damnation for her soul. The cavern pulsed like a living thing, its runes flaring as the warp's presence grew. Kalia crouched in the crevice, Torn's convulsions shaking the stretcher, his chants now a roar of forbidden words. Her hands trembled, holding the neurotoxin vial, its label warning of agonizing death to cleanse psychic taint. The cultists' chants grew louder, their leader raising a ritual dagger, warp energy crackling around him. A sudden collapse of the ceiling sent rocks tumbling, crushing a cultist and scattering the others. Kalaya seized the moment, dragging Torn closer to the console, its data, showing the ritual's climax. Torn's taint was the key. The whispers in her head were deafening, calling her a traitor, a heretic for hesitating. A mutant charged, its limbs twisted, and Kalia swung her kit, knocking it back, but its claws tore her thigh, blood soaking her uniform. Torn's eyes met hers, human, for a fleeting second, and she faltered. The cult leader's dagger glowed, the air tearing open with a warp rift's edge. Kalia uncapped the toxin, her heart breaking, and injected it into Torn's arm. His screams were immediate, his body arching as the poison burned through him, purging the taint in waves of agony. The cultists froze, their ritual faltering, and Kalia fled, tears blurring her vision, Torn's screams chasing her. Kalia limped through the Underhive's collapsing tunnels, Torn's screams fading but etched into her soul. Her body was a wreck, blood seeping from her wounds, her mind fraying under warp whispers that mocked her sacrifice. The cultists pursued, their footsteps echoing, their hounds' howls closing in. A sudden psychic pulse warped the tunnel, walls bending like flesh, and Kalia saw Torn's face in the shadows, accusing her. She stumbled, shaking off the vision, as a last bolt scorched the air, grazing her cheek. The cult leader, his rune-carved face twisted, led the chase, his plasma pistol glowing. Kalia dove into a side passage, the ground splitting as another quake hit, swallowing a hound in a spray of rubble. She clutched the data slate, its map showing a lift to the Hive's surface, her only chance at salvation. The whispers urged her to surrender, to join the cult, but she ran, her legs screaming with pain. A mutant lunged from a vent, its claws raking her back, and she swung her empty pistol, cracking its skull. The lift loomed ahead, its doors rusted but functional, and Kalia dove inside as the cultists closed in, their chants shaking the air. The lift groaned upward, its cables screeching as Kalia leaned against the wall. blood pooling from her wounds. The data slate her only proof of the cult's heresy. The whispers were relentless, accusing her of tainting herself with Torin's death. A sudden jolt shook the lift, a cultist's grenade exploding below, and the cables snapped, dropping the car a few feet before it caught. Callia's heart raced as she pried the doors open, crawling onto the Hive's surface, a wasteland of ash and ferrocrete under Omnium's void shields. Imperial Guard patrols spotted her, their lasguns raised, and she collapsed, the slate slipping from her hands. Medicae teams swarmed, their scanners beeping, injecting anti-psychic serums that burned her veins. The camp was a beacon. Radiation purgers, surgical suites, servitors tending survivors. Callia saw victims worse than Torin, their taint purged by machines she hadn't reached in time. An Inquisitor's acolyte approached, his gray robes marked with a silver eye, his gaze cold as he scanned the slate's data. He questioned her about Torin's taint, her use of the toxin, the ritual's disruption. The camp's hum drowned the whispers, but Callia felt their echo, wondering if she'd saved the Imperium or damned herself. Callia lay in a Medici pavilion, her wounds bandaged, her body cleansed of psychic taint, but marked by scars that would never fade. The camp bustled with survivors, but she felt alone. Torin's screams a permanent echo. The acolyte returned, his questions sharper, probing her decision to purge Torin, suggesting warp influence in her choice. The data slate confirmed the cult's plan, a demonic summoning stopped by her act. But the acolyte's eyes lingered, marking her as suspect. A sudden alarm blared as a psychic breach flared nearby, guards firing into the wastes at unseen threats. Callia's heart sank. The taint wasn't gone, and neither was her guilt. The Inquisitor's gaze felt like a blade, hinting she'd be watched, her loyalty questioned. She'd saved Nexara, maybe the Imperium, but at the cost of her brother and her faith. The whispers had faded, but she felt them in her bones, wondering if they'd ever truly leave. As she was led to temporary quarters in Omnium, the Hive's spires loomed, a cold reminder that her sacrifice had made her a hero and a heretic. Callia was alive, but the woman who'd loved Torin was dead, replaced by a hollow servant under the Emperor's unyielding gaze. Silent Kor was a void warden in Hive Zethra, a crumbling spire of ferrocrete and desperation that housed 10 million souls on the storm-racked world of Calyx Prime. Her days were spent in the humming control spires, calibrating the void shields that kept the planet's toxic tempests at bay. Her augmetic eye, a cold orb of steel grafted after a maintenance accident, scanned diagnostics, while her hands adjusted power relays. The Hive's shields flickered under constant strain, their generators groaning in the Underhive's depths. Silen's life was one of routine until the warp plague struck. It began with a flicker in the shield grid, a pulse of violet static that her augmetic registered as an error, but her gut knew was wrong. Workers in the lower wards began screaming, their minds unraveling as their eyes glowed with unnatural light. The Vox crackled with panic, Psychers unbound. Contagion in Subsector 7. Silent felt it, a static scream in her skull, clawing at her thoughts, resisted only by the augmetic's machine spirit. Her lover, Tane, a shield technician stationed at the core generator, hadn't reported in. As alarms wailed, Silent grabbed a shock maul from a fallen enforcer and descended, the Hive's walkways trembling under quakes. The air grew heavy, lumens pulsing violet, and panicked workers fled, some collapsing into spasms, their flesh rippling with glowing veins. A sudden psychic pulse hit, her augmetic sparking, and a worker lunged, his eyes blazing, swinging a pipe. Silent's maul cracked his skull, but the static in her head grew louder, whispering of storms beyond the shields. She pushed through collapsing gantries, her heart pounding for Tane, praying he was still human. The underhive loomed, a maze of sparking conduits and screams, and Sylens knew the plague's source was deeper, where the shield's core pulsed, and where Tane was last seen. The underhive's conduits were a labyrinth of rusted pipes and flickering cables, their walls slick with oil and blood. Sylens Core navigated the narrow passages, her shock maul humming, her augmetic eye straining to pierce the gloom. The warp plague's static buzzed in her skull, a relentless whisper urging her to kneel to the storm. The Vox, clipped to her belt, spat fragmented warnings of a cult, the Storm Veil, spreading the plague to summon a warp storm that would drown Zethra. Tane's last transmission had come from the core generator, a kilometer below, and Sylens' boots echoed on the grated floors as she descended. A sudden quake shook the conduit, sending sparks cascading, and a group of workers, now psychers with glowing eyes, charged from a side tunnel, their hands crackling with warp lightning. Sylens swung her maul, its electric pulse felling one, but another hurled a bolt that scorched her arm, the pain sharp through her warden's coat. She dove behind a pipe, her augmetic flickering, and returned fire with a scavenged last pistol, its beam cutting through a psycher's chest. The whispers grew sharper, promising Tane's safety if she joined the storm. Sylens shook them off, spotting a data shard in the rubble, its cracked screen showing a map to the core, generator, and runes of the Storm Veil. Tane's name flashed in the data, tied to the ritual, and her stomach twisted. Was he a victim or a traitor? The conduit shook again, a pipe bursting in a spray of coolant, and Sylens ran, her maul's charge dwindling, the whispers clawing at her resolve. Tane was close, but so was the cult, and the static in her augmetic screamed louder, a storm brewing in her mind. Sylens reached the core generator's outer chamber, a cavernous vault where the void shield's heart thrummed, its massive turbines pulsing with violet light. The air was thick with ozone and warp taint, the floor littered with bodies of technicians, their eyes burned out by psychic fire. Her augmetic eye sparked, the static scream now a howl, urging her to embrace the storm's power. Tane was here. She felt it, though the whispers mocked her hope. The Vox crackled with cultist chants, the Storm Veil's hymns echoing through the chamber. Sylens gripped her shock maul, its charge nearly spent, and crept past a turbine, spotting Tane's tool satchel among the debris. A sudden psychic pulse hit, her augmetic flaring, and she saw Tane, untouched, smiling, a warp-born lie. She shook off the vision, but a cultist in tattered robes lunged, his blade etched with runes, slicing her thigh. Sylens' maul cracked his ribs, but more emerged, their eyes glowing, chanting of a storm god. The data shard's map showed the ritual site deeper in the core, where Tane's taint fueled a warp rift. Sylens fought through, her last pistol's cell overheating, dropping cultists as turbines sparked and groaned. Tane's voice echoed in her mind, begging her to join the Veil, and her augmetic burned, resisting the warp's pull. Destroying the core could stop the rift, but would drop Zethra's shields, dooming the Hive to the planet's storms. As a turbine exploded, showering sparks, Sylens dove into a maintenance shaft, the whispers promising Tane's love if she surrendered. But she clung to her duty, her heart torn. The maintenance shaft was a claustrophobic tunnel of sparking wires and dripping coolant, leading to the core generator's heart. Sylens' augmetic eye flickered, its machine spirit faltering under the warp plague's pressure, the static scream now a deafening roar in her skull. Her shock maul was dead, its battery drained, and her last pistol had one shot left. The air pulsed with unnatural heat, the walls etched with glowing runes that burned her vision. Tane was close. She found his coat, torn and bloodied, near a sealed hatch. The Vox hissed with the Stormveil's chants, their voices warping the air, and Silen's heart sank as Tane's voice joined them, chanting of a storm's embrace. She pried open the hatch, revealing a chamber where the core's turbines spun wildly, violet energy crackling. Tane stood at the center, his eyes glowing, his hands raised in ritual, surrounded by cultists in rune-carved robes. His gaze met hers, human for a moment, pleading, but the warp's light consumed him. Silen's augmetics sparked, showing data from the shard. Tane's taint was the key to a warp rift. A cultist charged, his warp flame scorching her shoulder, and Silen fired her last shot, dropping him. The whispers offered Tane's salvation if she joined the Veil, but destroying the core would kill him and risk the Hive. As turbines screamed, threatening to collapse, Silen clutched a scavenged plasma grenade, its weight heavy with choice. Tane's human voice broke through, begging her to save him, and her augmetic burned, the storm's call tearing at her soul. The core chamber was a maelstrom of violet energy, the turbines screaming as warp lightning arced between them. Silen crouched behind a control console, her augmetic eye nearly blind from static. The warp plague's whispers, a chorus of storms promising power. Tane stood at the ritual's center, his body convulsing, violet light leaking from his eyes and mouth, his chants syncing with the turbine's hum. The Stormveil's leader, a gaunt figure in a rune-etched mask, raised a ritual staff, the air tearing with a warp rift's edge. Silen's last pistol was empty, her shock maul useless, but the plasma grenade in her hand pulsed with potential. The data shard's map confirmed the ritual's purpose. Tane's taint would open a rift, summoning a warp storm to drown Zethra. A cultist spotted her, hurling warp flame, and Silen dove, the console exploding in sparks. Her augmetics sparked, showing Tane's vitals, his heart erratic, his body a conduit for the warp. The whispers urged her to join him, to rule the storm, but her duty to the Hive burned stronger. Tane's eyes met hers, human for a fleeting second, and she hesitated, the grenade heavy. A turbine exploded, debris crashing, and Silen rolled clear, her leg bleeding from shrapnel. The cult leader's staff glowed, the rift widening, and Silen knew time was gone. She armed the grenade, its timer ticking, and threw it at the core, screaming Tane's name as the chamber shook, the warp's roar drowning her grief. The plasma grenade detonated, a white-hot flash that shattered the core generator's turbines, sending a shockwave through the chamber. Silen was thrown back, her augmetic eye blacking out. The warp plague's static scream silenced by the explosion's roar. The Stormveil's cultists screamed as the rift flickered, Tane's body collapsing, his chants cut off. The chamber buckled, pipes bursting in sprays of coolant, and Silen scrambled to Tane, his skin fever-hot, his eyes dimming but human. The cult leader lunged, his staff crackling, but a falling beam crushed him, his mask splintering. Silen dragged Tane through the collapsing chamber, her legs screaming with pain, her augmetics sparking back to life with fractured data. The Vox hissed with reports of failing void shields, the Hive trembling as Calyx Prime storms breached the outer wards. The whispers were gone, but Tane's shallow breaths tore at her heart. He was alive, but the taint lingered, his body frail. Silen found a maintenance lift, its cables groaning, and hauled Tane inside as the chamber caved in, cultists buried in rubble. The lift shuddered upward, sparks flying, and Silen's augmetic showed the shields at critical. Zethra was exposed. She clutched Tane, his hand gripping hers weakly, and prayed the Imperium could forgive her sacrifice. The lift's doors opened to a service tunnel, the air thick with storm winds, and Silen limped on, Tane's weight her only anchor. The service tunnel was a howling gauntlet, Calyx Prime's toxic winds breaching Zethra's failing shields, carrying ash and warp taint. Silent dragged Tane, his body limp, his breaths ragged, her augmetic eye flickering with static as it scanned for an exit. The Vox crackled with Imperial Guard orders. Evacuate Subsector 7. Purge protocols active. Her leg bled, shrapnel wounds burning, but she pushed through, the tunnel shaking as the Hive groaned under the storm's assault. The warp plague's whispers were gone, but Silent felt their echo, accusing her of damning Tane. A sudden gust carried a mutant psyker, its limbs twisted, hurling warp lightning. Silent dove, shielding Tane, and swung a scavenged pipe, cracking its skull. Her augmetic showed a surface access point ahead, a bunker used by wardens during shield failures. The storm's roar grew louder, the tunnel's walls cracking, and Silent stumbled, Tane's weight pulling her down. A lasbolt scorched the air, fired by a surviving cultist, his robes tattered, and Silent returned fire with a stolen laser gun, its cell low. The bunker loomed, its doors rusted but intact, and Silent dragged Tane inside, sealing them from the storm. Her augmetic flickered, showing Tane's vitals fading, the taint purged, but his body broken. The bunker's Vox relayed guard chatter. Purge teams were coming, and Silent knew they'd see her as tainted. She held Tane, his eyes flickering open, human but fading, and whispered apologies as the storm raged outside. The bunker was a cold vault of ferrocrete, its lumens flickering as Calyx Prime's storm battered Zethra's surface. Silent laid Tane on a maintenance cot, his breaths shallow, his skin pale but free of warp glow. Her augmetic eye, barely functional, scanned his vitals. His heart was failing, the taint gone, but the grenade's shockwave too much for his body. The Vox in the bunker crackled with guard orders. Purge all survivors, no exceptions. Silent's leg throbbed, blood soaking her coat, and her augmetic sparked, its machine spirit faltering. She found a Medici kit, its contents sparse, and injected Tane with a stim, his eyes fluttering open. He whispered her name, human but weak, and Silent's heart broke. She'd saved him from the warp, but not from death. The bunker's data console showed the Hive's shields offline, the storm flooding the lower wards. A sudden bang on the door signaled purge teams, their laser guns charging, and Silent barricaded it with crates, her hands shaking. The console revealed the Stormveil's plan. Tane's taint was to summon a warp storm, now halted, but at the cost of Zethra's defenses. Silent's augmetic flickered, showing a faint signal to an Arbite's outpost nearby, her only hope. She carried Tane, her strength fading, and pried open a vent, crawling through as the door buckled. The storm's howl filled the tunnel, and Silent clung to Tane, her duty to the Imperium warring with her love, knowing the Arbites might purge them both. The vent led to a surface access point, a blasted wasteland under Zethra's failing void shields, where toxic storms lashed ferrocrete ruins. Silent carried Tane, his body a dead weight, her augmetic eye dark, its machine spirit dead from warp overload. The Arbite's outpost loomed, a fortified spire surrounded by purge teams, firing at mutant stragglers. Silent's leg bled, her strength ebbing, but she staggered forward, Tane's faint pulse her only drive. The Vox hissed with Arbite's orders, no survivors from Subsector 7. Silent collapsed at the outpost's gate, Tane in her arms, and raised her warden's badge, shouting her rank. Arbite's enforcers, their carapace armor gleaming, dragged them inside, scanners beeping for warp taint. Silent's wounds burned as Medicae servitors injected anti-psychic serums, their needles biting. Tane was scanned, his taint gone, but his body failing, and Silent begged for a stim, her voice hoarse. An Arbit's judge, his face a mask of scars, reviewed the data shard Silen carried, its runes confirming the Stormveil's plan and her role in stopping it. His gaze was cold, questioning her exposure to the warp, her augmetic's failure marking her as suspect. Tane's hand gripped hers, his breath fading, and Silen whispered apologies, knowing she'd damned him to save Zethra. The judge ordered quarantine, and as servitors carried Tane away, Silen felt the storm's echo in her bones, wondering if her sacrifice had saved the Hive or marked her for purge. In the Arbite's outpost's Medicae bay, Silen lay bandaged, her wound stitched but her soul raw. Tane was gone, his body too weak to survive the purge's serums, his last breath a whispered Silen that haunted her. The bay hummed with servitors tending survivors, their scanners beeping, purging warp taint with brutal efficiency. Silen's augmetic eye was dead, its socket aching, and the storm's echo lingered in her mind, though the whispers were silent. The Arbit's judge returned, his scar-twisted face unreadable, holding the data shard. It confirmed. Silen's action stopped the Stormveil's ritual, saving Zethra from a warp storm, but the Hive's shields were down, and millions were dead in the flooded wards. The judge's questions were sharp. Why did she save Tane? Was she tainted? Her badge marked her a hero, but his gaze marked her a heretic. A sudden alarm blared, a new psychic breach in the wastes, mutants massing. Silen's heart sank. The taint wasn't gone, and her sacrifice felt hollow. The judge ordered her quarantine, her loyalty under scrutiny, and Silen was led to a cell, the Hive's spires looming through a cracked viewport. She'd saved Zethra, but at the cost of Tane and her faith. The storm's echo pulsed in her scars, a reminder of her duty's price. And as the cell door sealed, Silen wondered if the Imperium's gaze would ever see her as more than a suspect. Her love for Tane, her only crime.